Sometimes a good mistake is exactly what you need to make a movie scene work. These bloopers and errors technically shouldn't have happened, but once you watch the finished scenes, you'll be glad they did. There are countless stories of mistakes and spontaneous moments that happen on movie shoots. Sometimes these surprises give a scene a feeling of authenticity or a dose of inspiration. And if they're in the final cut, they definitely made the movie better. Here are some of our favorite unplanned essentials. More than 4 decades since hitting theaters, the 1976 boxing drama Rocky is a household name that's grown into a massive billion-dollar franchise. Like its protagonist, though, the film was a bit of an underdog when it was released. The budget for the first installment was slim relative to the surrounding industry, at just above $1 million. It recouped those expenses 225 times over, but the low-budget production of the first film is still apparent in various places. Sylvester Stallone wrote the screenplay in only 3.5 days, and the film was shot in just 4 weeks. He thought that if nothing else, the movie would show that, in his own words, an unknown quantity can produce a diamond in the rough, no matter how the circumstances of someone's life are stacked against them. The humble Italian stallion and his creator aren't the only unknown quantities that made Rocky a huge hit. Because of the low budget, there wasn't always enough funding to get extras, additional cameramen, or even permits. So when they shot the popular scene of Rocky running through the Italian market, they did it guerrilla style from the back of a van. Because of this setup, the stall owners didn't even know there was a movie being filmed. One of them just happened to toss Stallone an orange, and he managed to catch it. A wholesome, unplanned moment that set the tone and left us rooting for the hero even harder. Leonardo DiCaprio has subjected himself to all kinds of physical torment for the sake of various roles, most notably The Revenant in 2015, finally earning his long-overdue Oscar. The masterful performer really proved his mettle, though, when he powered through an injury where no reasonable person would have expected him to. As Calvin Candy in 2012's Django Unchained, DiCaprio played a posh and pampered plantation owner, the total opposite of the rugged trapper he portrayed in The Revenant. But during an outburst at the dinner table, DiCaprio's character slammed his hand down, and he actually cut himself on a piece of glass. Considering that the wound later required medical attention, no one would have blamed the actor for breaking character, rendering the scene unusable. But DiCaprio kept acting, at one point sadistically smearing his own blood across co-star Kerry Washington's face. This act represented the perverse, unhinged character so well that it was left in the final cut of the movie, making for an iconic scene in which DiCaprio not only stayed in character, but arguably elevated the moment. One transgression that often begs forgiveness on a movie set is forgetfulness. The job of an actor includes a lot of memorization, and every so often, someone forgets their lines. But occasionally, forgetting one's dialogue is the most true-to-character thing an actor can do. Of course, this is only the case if you're lucky enough to play a character who's, well, a bit of an airhead. Derek Zoolander in 2001's Zoolander is probably the poster child for this kind of role. In one famous scene, Ben Stiller forgets one of his lines, so he simply repeats something he said a minute earlier. At the beginning of the scene, he asks,
"So why male models?"
Zoolander is wondering why male models are chosen to become assassins. David Duchovny's character offers him an extensive explanation involving male models' advantageous physical condition and their ability to penetrate exclusive circles, not to mention their most important quality: they don't think for themselves. Stiller forgot what his response was supposed to be, so he improvised the now classic line.
"But why male models?"
You serious? I just told you that.
The image of an intimidating character casually stroking a cat with unnerving tenderness has become a bit of a trope, but it was completely unplanned when it occurred in 1972's The Godfather. Not only was it unscripted, it almost ruined the scene in which Marlon Brando, as Don Vito Corleone, nonchalantly discusses matters of life and death while caressing the feline in his lap. The key word, though, is almost. The feline actually ended up lending some extra life to the scene in a way that movie buffs love. The cat had been running around the studio earlier in the day, and when it ended up on Marlon Brando's lap during the scene, the animal lover just went with it, even though the sound crew worried that the cat's purring would ruin the Don's now iconic lines. Fortunately, the feline and the Oscar-winning actor were a perfect duo and totally stole the show. In The Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers, the second installment of Peter Jackson's trilogy, Legolas, Gimli, and Aragorn find the slaughtered band of Uruk-hai who captured Merry and Pippin, and they assume that the young hobbits have also been killed. In his grief, Aragorn takes out his anger on a nearby helmet. More than rage and defeat, though, Aragorn's outburst is one of pain. Actor Viggo Mortensen actually broke his toe on the take that made it into the final movie. An upset stomach on the set of 1981's Indiana Jones Raiders of the Lost Ark led to a script change that ended up becoming one of the film's most memorable moments. Harrison Ford revealed in a Reddit AMA that the script called for him to fight an expert swordsman, but he was suffering from dysentery and found it tough to be out of his trailer for more than a few minutes without having to run back to it. Reviewing the script had made it clear that it could take days to finish shooting the scene, which did not sound appetizing at all to Ford in his condition. So how did Ford get out of 3 days of shooting? By bringing a gun to a knife fight. The poor stuntman had practiced his swordmanship for days, only for his character to be coolly dispatched by Indy without any of the hand-to-hand, sword-to-whip combat he had been training for. A few movies throughout the decades stand out as examples of the quintessential and quotable New York City. One of the most famous of these films is Midnight Cowboy, and one line in particular has become a permanent part of pop culture.
I'm walking here! I'm walking here!
As for the origins of that famous line, it was improvised out of necessity because, as star Dustin Hoffman tells it, a cab driver ran a red light and drove right through the set, an occurrence that's itself quite a characteristic New York event. However, higher-ups on the film have questioned whether the moment truly was organic or whether there was an extra in the cab, and the truth is that it was a little of both. Allegedly, the team was inspired by the initial truly unplanned scene and then used an extra to recreate more takes like it. We don't know if the mistake was the original unscripted scene or if it was one of the recreations, but we do know that regardless of which version is true, the mistake, directly or indirectly, helped make the movie unforgettable. Daniel Craig emerging from the ocean in Casino Royale. It's an iconic scene that was never meant to happen. It certainly wasn't the plan to, with one lingering shot, reinvent the classic Bond character as a beefcake for a new generation of audiences, but that's exactly what it did. A moment from the scene was featured in the trailer and a still photo was used as promotional material. Fans even assumed the shot was a nod to Ursula Andress emerging from the sea in the original Bond movie Dr. No from 1962. If only all mistakes turned out this well. So how does something this great happen by accident? The original story Craig gave was that he was supposed to be swimming, but the water there was unexpectedly shallow due to the presence of a sand shelf in the area. So he stood up and walked off. In a later interview, he added that it was because he thought that he looked stupid, quote, pretending to be cool by swimming. Instead, he just stood up and walked off. So one of the most memorable shots of Craig's James Bond ended up not only being an accident, but a result of him throwing in the beach towel on a particular acting choice. Amelia Rinaldi, also known as Mia, initially has a great deal of trouble believing she's a princess. It just doesn't add up. At school, the protagonist of 2001's The Princess Diaries is clumsy, awkward, and unpopular, admiring it boys from afar but never really talking to anyone other than her best friend, who is also on the relative fringes of high school society. Even after she receives the royal treatment following the revelation of her identity and her crush begins to give her attention, their kiss is marred by the fact that her foot gets stuck in a fishing net. No amount of makeovers or royal shoe fittings can change the fact that Mia has 2 left feet. So when she and her friend Lily are walking on the bleachers in one scene and Mia slips and takes a dive, audiences are no more likely to bat an eye than Mia herself. This just seems like something that the often graceless heiress would do. Anne Hathaway, however, later said that she slipped and fell completely by accident, but despite bursting out laughing, she kept on acting. She never expected to see that moment again, much less that millions of people around the world would witness it. However, director Gary Marshall decided to use the take of Hathaway slipping above all the others.
He kept it. He kept it because it was a charming moment.
A good soldier fights through peril and injury, and apparently so does a good actor. You've probably heard of a number of performers who do their own stunts, but George McKay never expected one particular scene from the 2019 war film 1917 to put him on that list. While his character, Schofield's grueling sprint at the end of the film was undoubtedly an intense climax to his mission, the actor wasn't meant to take any hits as he ran across the battlefield. He had come out of rehearsal for the scene unscathed, but there are no guarantees of timing in such a complex scene. On the actual day of shooting, he found himself taking multiple blows from a slew of oncoming soldiers, but an actor keeps going until the director calls for a cut, and for such an important moment in the film, he knew he couldn't throw in the towel himself. So he kept moving, and director Sam Mendes never halted the take. He must have realized that, despite deviating from rehearsal, something even more intense was happening. McKay spoke to Jimmy Fallon about the take.
And again, we'd rehearsed it for weeks, and we'd rehearsed that you didn't get knocked into, and then on the day, you take some hits, but the rule is you don't stop unless they say stop.
The shot that was never meant to happen ended up being one of the greatest triumphs of McKay's performance. There are some moments that have widely been regarded as accidents, even by those who directed them, only for the actors involved to later allege the bungles were actually intentional moments of improvisation. One such moment, featuring Gandalf from the beginning of The Fellowship of the Ring, immediately comes to mind. Peter Jackson's commentary on the DVD states that this moment was an accident, that Ian McKellen truly did bonk his head, and that his acting remained so superb that Jackson decided to use the take anyway. It works to humanize the Great Wizard, and it cements the genuineness of the friendship between the mystical being and the Hobbit. On his website, however, McKellen states that the clumsy move was his idea, and Jackson simply didn't know.
Gotham's law-breaking taxi drivers, the Overlook's reality-bending layout, and Alicia Silverstone's hilariously genuine mispronunciation. Keep watching for some of the best movie mistakes that made it into the final cut. While filming The Princess Bride, Cary Elwes convinced Christopher Guest to hit him on the head with the pommel of his sword in a scene.
I swear it will be done.
This action was scripted, but the issue arose because they apparently didn't have a rubber prop sword to do the deed harmlessly. Elwes thought it would turn out fine if they just used a real one. Of course, he expected his co-star to give him a gentle tap. Certainly not the level of bludgeoning you'd rather have a stuntman step in for. But Guest apparently didn't know his own strength. It's part of the story for Elwes' character, Wesley, to get KO'd, so you might never have known the actor had really been knocked unconscious if not for an interview Elwes gave to Sundance TV describing the incident. He said that the next thing he knew, he was waking up in the hospital. The blow actually ended up creating a literal slapstick comedy moment that made it into the film and served its trademark zaniness incredibly well. Every job has its hazards. If you work in a kitchen, you run the risk of slipping on spills or burning yourself with hot cooking oil. If you work in an office, you might get carpal tunnel syndrome. And if you're Channing Tatum, portraying Olympic wrestler Mark Schultz in Bennett Miller's 2014 film Foxcatcher, you might break your hand, pop your eardrum, and cut your head open. All of these injuries actually befell Channing Tatum during the shooting of Foxcatcher. He broke his hand while training for the role, but you can see the other two mishaps during the film. When Mark Ruffalo's character roughs up Tatum's and clips him on the ear, you see Tatum wince. His eardrum actually popped in this moment. And when Tatum slams his head into a mirror, the cut you see on his head in the film is real. The actor went a little too hard in the moment and actually broke through the wall behind the prop glass. So, when you see the intensity of Channing Tatum's physical reactions in Foxcatcher, you're often seeing something all too real. Perhaps his most telling line from a Variety interview on the subject? Eardrums heal, so I'm fine. Sometimes you do the spit take, and sometimes the spit takes you. Or something like that. This mistake in The Martian is another case in which part of the action was scripted, but a mishap actually elevated it to the next level. The Martian is directed by Ridley Scott, a sci-fi legend who's apparently known for getting scenes done in just a few takes. This is opposed to the dozens of attempts that other directors might often employ to get things just right. His films are said to be full of banana peels because if someone accidentally slips and messes up, or eats it, as Donald Glover puts it, the clumsiness just makes it all the more real. Scott prefers this humanizing element, so he doesn't bother doing the scene over just because someone tripped, and you'll often see such unscripted stumbles in his films. In this particular instance, a nervous Glover slips and falls on some spilled coffee that he himself had spit out earlier into a wastebasket. He gets up, saying he's fine, and stays in character to complete the scene. The spitting out was scripted, but the slipping was not, so Glover was quite surprised when, after the scene, all Ridley Scott had to say was, "That was great." Actors like Channing Tatum and Donald Glover didn't have to go to the hospital for their injuries and slip-ups, but some performers weren't as lucky. Brad Pitt's character in David Fincher's Seven actually had to be changed to accommodate his arm injury, which he sustained during a chase scene. He accidentally put his arm through a windshield after a scripted fall from a fire escape. The star even required surgery for this wound. From that point on in the film, Pitt's character is always wearing a cast, which required Fincher to alter many other sequences in the movie to accommodate the injury. These scenes weren't just the ones that, in the film's chronology, came after the chase scene. After all, movies don't always shoot their scenes in the same order as they appear in the story, so there were a lot of scenes from before the chase that hadn't been shot yet, and Fincher had to hide Pitt's arm in these moments to disguise the injury, as it hadn't happened yet in the world of the story. In film, just because something is unscripted, that doesn't mean that it's a mistake. Some directors are pretty strict about improvisation while others encourage it. On the actor's end, some improvised moments work much better than others, but even the ones that don't go over well are typically conscious acting choices, not accidents. In the case of this sequence from Captain America: The First Avenger, you could say it was an improvisation, and that'd be partly true. But it still definitely qualifies as a mistake when you hear Haley Atwell tell it. In what Vanity Fair describes as your favorite scene in Captain America, Atwell's Peggy Carter sees Chris Evans' super soldier serum-saturated Steve Rogers with his shirt off for the first time. She reaches out in awe and seemingly involuntarily touches his chest. But this wasn't only Peggy's first time seeing Steve shirtless, it was also Atwell's first time seeing Evans shirtless. The actress said that she was compelled to impulsively touch Chris Evans' chest, and the director apparently thought it was so organic that you can see it in the film. By her account, it was less of a choice in character and more a compulsion in the moment as herself, practically an accident. But what a happy accident it was. Atwell, for her part, claimed that it was the highlight of her life. If you think that being in the background of the film means you're missing out on all the action, that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes you get even more action than you bargained for, and it's not always a pleasant or star-making experience. But you can rely on the eagle-eyed film enthusiasts of Reddit to eventually get you the recognition you deserve for taking a background blow like a champ. Blink and you'll miss it. But when Tom Cruise dismounts his horse in one scene in The Last Samurai, the steed kicks an extra in the crotch. You can tell from his reaction that it wasn't some sort of stunt. But once you see it, it's all the more impressive that the extra remains standing and, though he stumbles a bit, takes it like a true warrior. What's most alarming is that no one around him appears to flinch when it happens or check to make sure that he's okay. If you want to believe the best, you could read the lack of response as evidence of the stoicism of the soldiers. Either way, the injured soldier is a true champ. Imagine your first chest waxing and your first leading role in a film occurring at the very same time. It sounds like it'd be a lot of pressure and that things could potentially go really badly. That's exactly what happened to Steve Carell. His character in The 40-Year-Old Virgin, Andy, is trying to get into the dating world for the first time and, as the title of the film suggests, lose his virginity. He gets a lot of advice from some pretty questionable but well-meaning sources, which ultimately leads to him booking a waxing appointment.
Oh, that sounds like it would be nice.
Normally, a scene like this would be done with makeup and special effects, but Carell thought it would be better if the waxing was real. He assumed it wouldn't hurt that badly, but you can tell in the scene itself how shocked he is at his miscalculation. The pain is real. To make matters worse, the actor who played his waxer lied about being experienced in the procedure and apparently skipped an important protective step. That is, applying Vaseline to his nipples. Poor Steve. The master of physical comedy really went to his limits this time, and thankfully, it's not completely embarrassing. Rather, it's a hilarious and memorable scene, and the film wouldn't be the same without it. Have you ever noticed that in many scenes in the MCU movies, Tony Stark is munching on some sort of snack? It's easy to believe that it's just part of his character. He's quirky in many other ways and always does whatever he wants. So why should the end of the world keep him from snacking? Well, apparently this habit was never part of Stark's character in the beginning. Robert Downey Jr. would just hide snacks all over the set and randomly start munching out during takes without telling anyone he was going to. There was nothing anyone could do about it since they never knew when it was going to happen, so the production just made constantly eating and drinking a comedic part of Iron Man's cavalier character. And honestly, it fits just fine. Is it a mistake? It would have been for a lesser actor, as it likely would have gotten them fired or at least heavily reprimanded, but RDJ took his snacking and made a meal out of it. A series of mistakes in Titanic turned out to be a blessing in disguise. Believe it or not, Jack's now famous exclamation at the tip of the ship wasn't originally in the script. In fact, he and director James Cameron had tried a bunch of different lines in its place, and they all fell flat. Time was running out and the production was losing light, but finally, after a bunch of mistake lines, an exasperated Cameron told DiCaprio to just say, "I'm king of the world." And apparently DiCaprio really didn't want to at the time, responding to Cameron's direction with an unconvinced, "What?" and repeating the question when Cameron reiterated his instructions. To the second objection, Cameron simply replied with, quote, "Just sell it."
I'm the king of the world!
We're eternally grateful that the previous scripted attempts turned out to be mistakes. Mistakes that, in their wake, made room for one of the most recognizable lines in one of cinema's most revered films. We'd love to know what some of those failed lines were, though. When the futuristic bat vehicles dominate the screen in the Dark Knight trilogy, most people really aren't paying attention to much else. But if you check the traffic in the background, there are quite a few scenes in which Gotham citizens don't appear to be obeying traffic rules. These sequences usually occur in high-speed, quickly cut chase scenes, so they're easy to miss and, if we're being honest, a little nitpicky to point out even if you do catch them. Still, the other drivers on the road as the Caped Crusader rides his Batpod after the Joker are blatantly ignoring streetlights. Of course, the taxi drivers who nearly crash into the Batpod and honk as he whizzes through them are most likely stunt drivers given how close they come to colliding with him. Not to mention that these near encounters were great to emphasize the peril of the chase, but if you look closely, the lights facing left and right, where the vehicles come from, are red. These collisions should have never happened. You could nitpick and say it ruins the realism, but we disagree. The whole premise of Nolan's trilogy is that Gotham is a city of debauchery, mayhem, and moral bankruptcy. There's often explicit debate as to whether it can be saved. We naturally conceive of that in epic cinematic terms. Grand-scale sociopaths like the Joker, corrupt officials at the highest levels, and sky-high crime rates. But if Gotham truly is a lawless city, wouldn't that extend to every area of life? If people aren't going to follow the law when it comes to fraud, murder, and greed, why would they when it comes to traffic? Many injuries are the result of talented, invested actors taking their scripted scenes a little too far. It's a testament to their acting that they're willing to risk a bodily injury in order to fully inhabit a scene, but we hope they don't make a tradition out of needing stitches. In Nightcrawler, Jake Gyllenhaal plays a freelance photojournalist named Lou who enters the competitive business of covering violent incidents like crashes and crimes and selling the footage to news stations. Naturally, he develops an unsettling obsession with his work and uses increasingly questionable means to obtain the most compelling footage before any of his competitors. This means going so far as to tamper with crime scenes and manipulate police, journalists, and criminals. It goes without saying that the guy is intense. At one point, he punches a mirror, which was part of the script. Jake Gyllenhaal needing stitches in his hand afterward, though, that was not part of the plan. Even still, it all fits incredibly well with a seedy character who will go to any lengths to get what he wants. You might have been told as a kid that sugar can make your teeth fall out, but for one young extra in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, this threat became all too real in an unexpected way. When confectionery magnate Willy Wonka announces his golden ticket sweepstakes, it inspires a frenzy as people everywhere flock to candy stores in hopes of finding a ticket. In one scene, a crowd of children clamor at the counter of a sweet shop. The proprietor, while singing the now famous The Candyman tune, graciously invites the children behind the counter to select their treats. But if you watch closely, he almost knocks one little girl's teeth out. This moment hasn't been spoken about in interviews, likely in part because the film vastly predated internet discourse on such subjects. But it's a very small chance the sequence was scripted or directed this way. You can see from the clip that the little girl actually gets clocked by the fold-up counter. It's pretty safe to assume that they didn't plan for this and then bring a 6-year-old stunt girl on set to get nailed in the face. What makes this goof so perfect, though, is how the little girl doesn't seem fazed at all. She still rushes past the counter to get at the candy. It makes her seem so hilariously invested in the treats that she doesn't notice getting hit on the chin. And she won't be the last child in the film whose dogged pursuit of sweets gets her into trouble. While it's also full of all the sweetest things in life, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory has more than one mistake hidden under the wrapper. And one continuity error in this film accidentally makes a pretty powerful statement. When the malnourished Charlie eats what's probably his first ever Wonka bar, we see him take a bite in one shot while his mouth is already stuffed. But in the next shot, just a couple of seconds later, his mouth is totally empty. You can't swallow almost an entire chocolate bar in a matter of seconds. It definitely can't be done without making a mess or at least needing to catch one's breath afterwards. At first glance, this is an extremely minor continuity error, and again, since this is a viewer-caught slip-up in an old film, it hasn't been addressed as a mistake by anyone connected with the feature. We're just deferring to the laws of physics here. But on that note, this mistake can totally be spun as the whimsical film's magical realist take on just how ravenous Charlie is for the first ever taste of Wonka chocolate in his impoverished life. The layout of the Overlook Hotel in The Shining, Stanley Kubrick's film adaptation of Stephen King's disquieting horror novel, is spatially impossible. If you try to match what you see inside the hotel with what you see on the exterior, there's simply no way to make it work. But when you think about the story itself, everything about the sinister, seemingly sentient hotel defies logic and is meant to confuse the viewer and occupants and drive them slowly mad. So why not the architecture itself? Some people staunchly argue that The Shining set features many impossibilities, from windows that shouldn't exist to doors that lead nowhere to entire rooms that couldn't possibly fit inside the hotel. Others, however, say it's all part of Kubrick's genius and that the hotel itself is clearly a supernatural disorienting force, an illusion in and of itself in many ways. It would certainly lend new and unsettling meaning to the now famous sequences of Danny riding his tricycle through the Byzantine twists and turns of the hotel's hallways. He may be wheeling in and out of reality. Self-absorbed Cher, living up to the title of the film Clueless, mispronounces words throughout the movie. But what you might not know is that actress Alicia Silverstone herself is making these errors. Whenever you hear her articulate a word slightly wrong, there's a good chance that the mistake is genuine. Apparently, after Silverstone had made a few mistakes in the debate scene, members of the Clueless cast and crew attempted to help her out by correcting her. However, director Amy Heckerling called for everyone to stand down. She felt that mispronouncing Haitians as Haitians is something Cher's ditzy and self-absorbed character would totally do.
So, if the government could just get to the kitchen, rearrange some things, we could certainly party with the Haitians.
And she was absolutely right. Cher's mispronunciations serve as foreshadowing for the growth she will experience over the course of the movie. That is, from the selfish, ignorant girl she once was to the conscientious, caring person she always had the potential to be. And these competing elements wouldn't have been expressed as well without those delightful mispronunciations.
Hey, accidents happen. But if you're in a movie, sometimes accidents can turn out to be amazing. In fact, some of the most memorable moments in cinema were actually the result of mistakes that the filmmakers decided were too good to leave out of the finished movie. Here's a look at some movie bloopers that were too good to cut. Alfred Hitchcock coined the term MacGuffin to describe important objects upon which the plot of a movie revolves, like the briefcase in Pulp Fiction or the Infinity Stones in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. As any comic fan will tell you, the Infinity Stones are incredibly important and powerful, which is why it's so funny when Chris Pratt as Star-Lord just straight up drops one.
Let us see what you brought.
It looks totally scripted, but according to the DVD commentary, that was an actual moment of clumsiness from Pratt. But the moment works, so director James Gunn left it in. As war looms and the loss of Rohan seems imminent, Eowyn stares off into the distance as the camera reveals a wide scenic shot. As she does, a flagpole whips in the wind, and then, perfectly expressing the mood of uncertainty and destruction to come, the flag rips off the pole and flies away. The metaphor was not only beautifully apt, but it was also totally accidental. Director Peter Jackson didn't plan for this, it was just really windy on that day of shooting. Indiana Jones wasn't the only Raider of the Lost Ark in Raiders of the Lost Ark. There was also evil French archaeologist René Belloc, who suffers a doubly horrible fate. Not only does his head explode, but he also eats a fly. Well, okay, not exactly. During a close-up of actor Paul Freeman, a fly appears to crawl right down Belloc's throat. Freeman later revealed that the insect actually flew away after crawling around his lip for a moment, but some judicious editing after the fact made it look like the cold-blooded Belloc just ate the fly instead. The police lineup scene early in the movie is crucial to the plot of The Usual Suspects. It's where all the criminal main characters meet to arrange a big heist. As each character steps forward to read the line police told them to read, none of them can contain their laughter, perfectly setting up the dynamic between the characters as well as their collective disregard for the cops. But the laughing wasn't in the script, and it wasn't a directorial note. No, the cast of The Usual Suspects couldn't stop laughing because actor Benicio del Toro couldn't stop farting. Co-star Kevin Pollak says he farted on like 12 takes in a row. Director Bryan Singer got so mad with the cast's inability to focus that he yelled at them, which probably only made them laugh harder. Speaking of farts, Rain Man is that rare film that won the Oscar for Best Picture and also included one of the most memorable fart scenes in movie history. Brothers Raymond and Charlie are in a phone booth together and Raymond passes gas.
Uh-oh, fart.
Yeah, Charlie Babbitt, I'll hold.
Fart.
Did you fart, Ray?
Fart.
How can you stand that?
I don't mind.
That was real and accidental. Stars Dustin Hoffman and Tom Cruise both managed to stay completely in character, setting up a classic moment in cinematic fart history.